Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series for macroeconomic principles. And in this, we're going to take a look at inflation, in particular, two different ways that inflation could occur in the macroeconomy. The first we're going to take a look at is cost push and demand pull. So what we're going to start out with, and again, we're starting out with an equilibrium in the macroeconomy. It's where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect one another. And at that point, we have an equilibrium price level for the economy, the overall price level, and we also have equilibrium income slash output in the economy. So where aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect one another, that's where we're going to have our equilibrium price level and aggregate output slash income. What we want to take a look at is what if there is what economists refer to as a supply shock. And the supply shock that we're going to take a look at is where firms across the entire economy see a dramatic increase in the cost of doing business. All right, so let's take a look at the impact of that. If there's going to be an increase in the cost structure, aggregate supply is going to shift to the left. So you can see here our aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, and we are relabeling the aggregate supply curve as aggregate supply 1 to distinguish it between the original aggregate supply curve. And the new equilibrium is going to occur where aggregate supply 1 intersects aggregate demand 0. And you can see here that when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, you can see that this is going to be inflationary, that our expectation is going to be that the price level is going to increase. We also want to take a look at what's going to happen to aggregate output slash income. And we can see here that aggregate income falls. So when we have a supply shock, where we have a shock where costs are going up across the entire economy, the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. And in essence, what's going to happen is we're going to move into a recession. Aggregate output is going to shrink, but it's also going to be inflationary. So we're going to have a recession where we actually have inflation occurring in the economy. Now, the example that I oftentimes give with this is in the United States in the early 70s, in 1973, OPEC placed an oil embargo on the United States in 1973. This restricted the supply of oil coming into the United States, which drove gasoline prices up, and pretty much all sectors of the economy were affected by this. So we had a dramatic increase in gasoline prices, which drove up costs for firms. So that is an example of that, and that is the example of stagflation that is talked about in your textbook. All right, and in stagflation, what we're going to have is we're going to have a period where we have an inflationary period, but the economy is stagnant. So here is an example of stagflation. And this is caused by a supply shock in the economy, where there was a direct increase in gasoline prices because of the OPEC oil embargo. The reaction to this was that the aggregate supply curve shifted to the left. This caused inflation. The price level went from P0 to P1, and aggregate output decreased. It went from Y0 to Y1. This is an example of cost push inflation. It's cost push because it's the way it's referred to is that when these costs go up, it pushes the aggregate supply curve to the left, which pushes prices upward. So realize this is an example of stagflation, where you have an inflationary period that's also accompanied by low output. Now we can also look at this a shock, but we can look at a shock from the demand side. So once again, we're going to start at an equilibrium in the macroeconomy where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect one another. This gives us an equilibrium price level and an equilibrium output slash income level. Now we're going to take a look at if we have a demand shock, and we're going to show the demand curve shifting to the right. So if there's an increase in aggregate demand, what is going to be the impact on the price level and aggregate output? So we have the aggregate demand curve shifting to the right. We relabel aggregate demand 1 to distinguish it from aggregate demand 0 and aggregate demand 1. So this is the new aggregate demand curve. And we can see that if there's a stimulus that causes aggregate demand to shift to the right, this is inflationary. The price level will increase. The difference between this and the supply shock that we talked about is that we see aggregate output increasing. So with aggregate demand shifting to the right, it does build in or cause inflationary pressures and prices to increase, but it also causes aggregate output/income to increase at the same time. This is an example of demand pull inflation. As the demand curve is shifting to the right, it is pulling the price level up, but it's also increasing aggregate output and aggregate income.